In this talk, I'm going to introduce some of the key foundations of qualitative research in psychology. In this talk, I will cover some important philosophical concepts, including ontology and epistemology. I'll explain some epistemologies, including positivism and social constructionism. I'll overview the history of qualitative research in psychology and introduce the spectrum of qualitative approaches. I'm going to start by explaining a few important terms that underpin the research approaches that we use in psychology. The first is ontology, and this is part of a philosophy that deals with questions about the nature of reality and what exists. Key ontological questions are whether or not there is a social reality that exists independently of human conceptions and interpretations, and whether there is a shared social reality or only multiple context-specific ones. These ontological positions about what exists can inform our decisions about how we know what we know. This is our epistemology. Epistemology is concerned with the ways of knowing and learning about the world, and focuses on issues such as how we can learn about reality and what forms the basis of our knowledge. Key epistemological questions are: how is knowledge best acquired? For example, using induction, where our approach is bottom-up and patterns are derived from observations of the world, or deduction, using a top-down approach, where we make a hypothesis based on what we already know and gather evidence to test this theory or hypothesis, or perhaps a combination of the two. We also want to know: what influence does the relationship between the researcher and the research have on that knowledge? Is the researcher an objective and value-free observer, or does the researcher play an active and interactive role in the construction of knowledge? Positivism is an epistemological position that argues that there is a straightforward relationship between the world and our perception of it. Therefore, we can know about reality by collecting data that represents these perceptions of the world. When we describe what is out there in our reality, our descriptions are assumed to be accurate representations of the world, and there is a direct correspondence between things and their representation. This is the standpoint of many in the natural sciences, such as physics or chemistry. The goal of research is to produce objective, impartial and unbiased knowledge. Very few researchers in psychology would claim to be straightforward positivists. In fact, the term is often used as an insult in epistemological debates, as most researchers now acknowledge that complete, objective, impartial and unbiased research is an unachievable aim. People are not things to research, as in the natural sciences. They are people with agency who interact with each other in social contexts. Instead of arguing about being completely objective or not, debates tend to focus on the extent to which our work can produce objective knowledge or truth about the world. This moves on to Popper. Popper was critical of inductive approaches to knowledge generation, as these could not prove a theory true. This led to the hypothetico-deductive model, using deduction as a process of falsification. This is what we know from the statistical approaches covered in the module so far. A hypothesis is made on the priori theory, and this is tested to see if it can be disproved. This approach has dominated much of the psychology research and theory to date. You might ask whether qualitative psychology is a relatively new psychological phenomenon. To put it simply, no. While many presentations of qualitative psychology depict it as a newcomer to psychological research and an uprising against the dominance of quantitative methods in the early 19th century, the reality is that qualitative methods have been in existence since the inception of psychology itself. In fact, early psychology in America and Germany showed that introspection was their method of gaining psychological knowledge. Introspection involves looking inward at your own conscious sensations, perceptions and thoughts, and interrogating and cataloguing these. Early research methods were therefore a form of internal self-observation and first-person study, clearly a qualitative approach. However, the development in the early 20th century of Watson's behaviourism resulted in a critique of these research approaches, labelling them as unscientific. This moved psychology away from the study of the mind and instead to a focus of a study of behaviour. With it was a desire for recognition like that of the natural sciences, and therefore the development of methods that could be employed with objectivity. These continued with the cognitive revolution in the second half of the 20th century, where focus was once again given to the processes of the mind rather than just behaviour. As quantitative methods then began to dominate mainstream psychology, psychology became recognised as a science in its own right. By the 1980s, dissatisfaction with the dominance of quantitative methods had begun to grow, and a number of oppositional qualitative research approaches began to develop within psychology and the broader social sciences. Approaches including feminism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, social constructionism, hermeneutics, and phenomenology all began to question and reject the positivist stance with which psychological research was being conducted, instead arguing for the recognition that humans operate within a subjective and interpreted world, with the potential for multiple and changing views of reality. This move to acceptance of qualitative methods is a critique of approaches that have dominated the discipline for decades, and therefore represents a challenge to the foundations of the discipline. As a result, the response to qualitative research has been in some cases hostile, and qualitative methods are not simply a complementary approach to quantitative research. Furthermore, it's difficult to offer a neat or coherent definition of qualitative research, since it can encompass so many different methodological practices, as I will outline next. Social constructionist approaches are very different to the traditional psychological research based on positivist assumptions. This type of research rejects positivism. It's critical of taken for granted ways of viewing the world. We cannot be objective observers of the world as we are part of it. We need to think critically about any assumptions we make about how things are and consider where and how that knowledge was produced. Knowledge is also culturally and historically specific. The way in which the world works and what is taken for granted changes over time and is bound by the culture in which that knowledge was shaped and created. People construct knowledge through social processes, and reality is shaped by the ways in which phenomena are represented and understood. And knowledge is also linked to social action. An example is if you think about the scene in The Little Mermaid, in which Ariel is at the dinner table with the prince and she picks up a fork excitedly and begins to brush her hair, much to the disgust and surprise of others around the table. The meaning of what the fork is has been created by Ariel through her interactions with Scuttle the seagull and associations to other things she knows, like a hairbrush. Therefore, her reality of this has been shaped by social processes, and is now reshaped by the reactions and behaviours of those around her at the dinner table, as she realises the fork holds an alternative purpose and meaning. Qualitative research represents a continuum of approaches. One way to think about how these approaches work in practice is to imagine a research study. Imagine a participant tells you that they believe in unicorns. There are different decisions about what that information is able to tell you. As a positivist, you assume what your participant tells you is real. Therefore, you would assume that unicorns are real and that the participant experiences these. What the participant has told you reflects a single, stable reality in which unicorns are trotting around. As a critical realist, you are likely to assume that the experience of the belief in unicorns is a reality for that participant in that time and place. A good example would be perhaps a 4-year-old telling you about unicorns. To that child, unicorns might exist. However, as they get older, their ideas about the reality of unicorns is likely to change. The reality of unicorns is therefore not a static, non-changing entity. As a social constructionist, you are interested in why the participant has told you about their belief in unicorns. If you think about perhaps a t-shirt with this stated on it, there are reasons why a person might decide to present themselves in this way. For example, to appear quirky, humorous, or whimsical. You are interested in the function of the statement and the potential reality that that constructs. Therefore, the methods and methodologies employed in research are based on particular assumptions about the nature of reality and what we can know, in addition to how we can know it. You can think about the decisions made like a research tree. One way to picture the links between the concepts that I've been discussing is to look at a research tree. There are some distinct paths between the philosophical positions at the root and trunk of the tree and the branches and leaves that can develop from these ways of thinking. You can think of the roots as an ontology, how we view the world. You can think of the trunk as epistemology, how we can investigate the world. You can think of the branches as methodology, how we can approach data collection and analysis. And you can think of the leaves as the methods, the specific approaches we use to collect the data. For example, if you think of interviews as your leaf, then your branches are qualitative. Your trunk is likely to fit with an inductive approach that acknowledges a researcher's role and rejects objectivity, and your roots are likely to be critical realist or relativist. To summarise what I've discussed today, research approaches are underpinned by ontological and epistemological philosophical concepts. Ontology is concerned with the nature of reality. Epistemology is concerned with how we can find out about the world. Even the earliest psychologists used qualitative methods, but qualitative research itself was not recognised until the 1980s. There are a spectrum of qualitative approaches, all of these with varying underpinning philosophies.